Ladies and gentlemen, sons and daughters of purpose, listen to me. There comes a moment in your life where you must stop asking, why did they leave, and start declaring, they couldn't replace me. We are not here today to expose the narcissist. We are here to expose you to your power, your position, and your purpose. Let me teach you something. When you walked into their life, you didn't just enter as a person, you entered as a mirror. A mirror that didn't just reflect what they pretended to be, but what they truly were. Your presence had a way of peeling back the layers they worked so hard to construct. You weren't trying to investigate or expose. You were simply being who you are, authentic, genuine, and perceptive. But even without trying, you saw things others missed. You noticed the inconsistency between their words and actions. You picked up on the subtle manipulation that others chalked up to charm. You recognized the gap between their public image and private intentions. The truth is, when people live behind masks, they fear anyone who can see through them. The narcissist thrives in environments where people are easily dazzled by appearances. They crave circles where ego is mistaken for confidence and control is mistaken for leadership. But you discerned. You didn't just listen to what they said. You paid attention to how they made you feel. You observed patterns. You asked the questions no one else dared to ask. And most of all, you refused to accept surface-level answers when your spirit was unsettled. Your ability to see through the illusion didn't just make them uncomfortable, it threatened their entire system. A narcissist builds their world on curated perception. But you brought reality into the room, and reality is a threat to anything rooted in deception. You weren't disruptive in behavior. You were disruptive in energy. You didn't yell or accuse. You simply existed in your truth. And when truth walks into the room, lies become naked. Manipulation loses its grip, pretending no longer works. This is why they began to shift. You may have noticed the defensiveness, the gaslighting, the attempts to make you question your clarity. They tried to blur your vision, not because you were wrong, but because you were right. When a narcissist sees someone who cannot be fooled, they go into survival mode. They attack your confidence, your perception, your emotions, because they cannot afford for you to keep seeing clearly. They may call you too sensitive, too intense, or too much. But what they're really saying is, you're too aware for me to continue playing my game. And that awareness made you irreplaceable. Because not everyone carries the courage to confront what's beneath the surface. Most are content with comfort. Most want to maintain the peace, even if the peace is fake. But not you. You had a quiet boldness, a spiritual radar, a kind of wisdom that could not be bought or manipulated. And that made you dangerous, not in a destructive way, but in a way that brings awakening. You disturbed the false reality they carefully constructed, not with force but with presence. It wasn't just that you exposed them to others, it was that you exposed them to themselves. You were the reminder of what they tried to forget, the mirror of what they didn't want to confront. And for people who are committed to staying in denial, confrontation feels like betrayal. But hear this, what they called betrayal was actually integrity. What they labeled disloyalty was actually clarity. You refused to participate in the lie. You chose to stand in truth, even if it cost you their approval. And here's the deeper truth. They may have left, but they never replaced you. Because people who expose truth can't be swapped out like a piece of furniture. You were an experience, not a transaction. A revelation, not a role player. Others may come and flatter, comply, or submit. But they won't bring the conviction you carried. They won't spark the inner awakening you did. They won't make them feel seen the way you did, because most people are just looking, not truly seeing. So don't mourn your ability to perceive. Don't regret your gift of clarity. Don't curse the moment you saw too much. That insight was a divine deposit, a sacred assignment. You were meant to walk in truth, even if others choose illusion. And though they may never admit it, your presence wasn't just impactful, it was unforgettable. You didn't just walk into their life, you walked in with vision. And no one forgets the one who saw them before they ever saw themselves. They say boundaries are the silent protectors of the soul. They're not loud, they don't shout, but they speak volumes about who you are and what you will not tolerate. And the moment you start establishing boundaries, you will see who respects you and who was only using you. You see, the narcissist isn't drawn to strength. They are drawn to opportunity. They search for access, for open doors in your emotional walls, for spaces in your identity where they can manipulate, control, and dominate. And when you shut those doors, when you start saying, no, you can't cross that line, everything changes. Boundaries don't just protect you. They define you. They tell the world what you are and are not available for. They clarify your standards. And more than that, they preserve your peace, your energy, your purpose. The narcissist thrives in chaos and confusion. Their power is rooted in blurred lines, in gray areas, in emotional entanglement. But when you walked in and made things clear, when you began to honor yourself, speak truth, and protect your space, they lost the very power they depended on. There was a time maybe when you gave too much, you tolerated too much, you justified too much. You saw the potential in them. You hoped, believed, prayed they would change. But growth taught you something important. Potential is not permission. Just because someone could be better doesn't mean they will. And it's not your job to carry the cost of their refusal to grow. So what did you do? You changed the rules. You started saying things like, I will no longer accept disrespect in the name of love. Or if your presence disrupts my peace, you don't get to stay. And let me tell you, that kind of clarity is like poison to manipulation. Because the narcissist depends on your confusion, on your self-doubt, on your guilt. They know how to twist your compassion against you. But when you stopped second-guessing yourself and started standing firm, their games no longer worked. You might not have yelled. You might not have fought. You didn't need to. Your silence, your distance, your refusal to engage was louder than any argument. That's what many people don't understand. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is disengage, not because you're weak, but because you finally realized your energy is too sacred to waste on someone who refuses to grow. You see, boundaries are not about punishment. They're about protection. You weren't trying to hurt them. You were trying to heal you. You weren't being cruel. You were being clear. And clarity to someone who feeds on control feels like rejection. But it wasn't rejection. It was redirection. It was you stepping back into alignment with your values, your peace, your God-given identity. They called it changing. They said, you're different now. And yes, you were. But it wasn't bitterness. It was wisdom. Pain had taught you what love was not. Disrespect had taught you what honor required. And manipulation had taught you how to finally choose you. What made you irreplaceable wasn't that you stayed, but that you eventually refused to be used. That's the turning point. That's when they began to realize they had lost something they didn't fully value until it was no longer available. Because the truth is, narcissists don't mourn people. They mourn the loss of power. And when you set boundaries, when you removed access, when you stopped reacting, they no longer had a script to follow. You stepped out of their cycle. You rose above the game. You didn't just say you loved yourself. You started acting like it. And I want you to hear me clearly. That decision, that spiritual shift, that internal alignment, that's why you couldn't be replaced. Because they can find another person to charm. They can find another crowd to impress. But they'll never find another version of you, the one who looked them in the eye, stood firm in truth and said, I know who I am and I will not shrink to keep you comfortable. That's the kind of power no one can imitate. That's the kind of presence no counterfeit can match. You became a boundary they couldn't cross. And that's why they had to walk away. You didn't need validation to feel valuable. That was your silent power. You didn't walk into the relationship asking them to define you. You weren't waiting for someone to tell you who you were because you already knew. You knew your value before they complimented you, and you didn't shrink the moment they criticized you. That kind of inner awareness unsettles people who depend on control to feel powerful. A narcissist needs to feel superior. They need someone who's unsure of themselves, someone who seeks approval, someone who can be shaped and reshaped to fit their fragile ego. But when you know your worth, you break the mold they try to put you in. This is why they couldn't replace you. Because you weren't formed in their image. You didn't need them to clap for you to feel accomplished. Your sense of identity wasn't built on their praise. It was rooted in purpose. That's what made you unshakable. And here's the truth most people miss. When you carry intrinsic value, people either honor you or try to diminish you. The narcissist chose the latter, not because you lacked anything, but because your self-assurance threatened their illusion of control. You see, the narcissist operates best when they can convince you that you're broken and that they're the answer. But when you don't believe that lie, when you come into the room already whole, already grounded, already centered, they have nothing to manipulate. They couldn't gaslight you into questioning your reality because your reality was built on something they couldn't access. Truth. That makes you irreplaceable. Not because you were perfect, but because you were real. And when someone real meets someone who's performing, the performance begins to fall apart. You became the mirror they couldn't look into for too long. Because while they were pretending, you were living in authenticity. You didn't have to fake kindness, fake strength, fake joy. You embodied it. And that kind of light exposes every shadow. They may have acted like they were superior, like they were above you, but that was theater. The applause they sought in public was often their only source of validation. You didn't need an audience, you had peace. And peace can't be faked. It can't be performed. That's why they couldn't imitate you and certainly couldn't replace you. They tried to find another version of you, someone who would be easier to manipulate, someone they could mold. But what they found was surface-level connections. You can replace proximity, but you can't replace essence. You were the essence, the original. And it wasn't just your confidence, it was your ability to stand firm when most would fold. It was the way you didn't need to argue to be right, didn't need to beg to be loved. It was how you could walk away with your dignity intact while they kept replaying the same broken narrative in their mind. That grace, that strength, that quiet power, that's rare. People who know their value don't chase. They don't bargain for love. They don't stay where they're tolerated just to feel needed. And that's exactly what you embodied. That's why even after they tried to replace you, even after they moved on quickly or painted a different picture to the world, they kept glancing back because they couldn't find someone who wouldn't break under pressure. They couldn't find someone who wouldn't fall for the same games. They couldn't find someone who loved with the same depth and had the same backbone. That's the danger of being whole in a world that thrives on brokenness. You become the exception, and exceptions are never easily forgotten. So don't ever let their silence make you question your value. Don't let their attempts to replace you make you doubt your impact. Your value was never tied to how they treated you. It was revealed in how you walked away with truth in your spirit and love still in your heart. They didn't discard you because you weren't enough. They lost you because they were never capable of handling someone who didn't need to be completed. You weren't looking for someone to fix you. You were walking in fullness. That's what made you different. That's what made you unforgettable. That's what made you irreplaceable. You didn't need them, they needed you. And that truth alone disrupts every illusion they tried to sell you. For a long time, they had you questioning your own significance. They played the game so well, convincing you that you were the dependent one, that you were clingy, too emotional, too intense. But that was never the truth. The reality was this: you were the lifeline, the anchor, the well they kept drawing from, even while pretending they were the ocean. Let's break this down, because until you understand this principle, you'll keep second-guessing your impact. Narcissists are not attracted to the broken. They are drawn to the strong. They don't come after people who have nothing to offer. They seek out the ones with overflowing hearts, with boundless empathy, with emotional depth and spiritual light. Why? Because they need something they cannot produce for themselves. They're not looking for love, they're looking for supply. And you, whether you knew it or not, became their supply line. They needed your validation because they couldn't find value in themselves. They needed your attention because deep down they felt invisible. They needed your belief in them because they had no belief in themselves. So they crafted a performance that would hook you. Words that mimicked love, gestures that looked like commitment, timing that made you feel chosen. But all of it was built on a need to survive through you, not thrive with you. And here's what makes this so powerful. You thought you were being pulled into their orbit because of mutual desire. But in truth, they were orbiting around your light. They couldn't manufacture wholeness, so they stayed close to yours. Every time you forgave them, it reinforced their sense of control. But underneath that control was desperation, because deep down they knew they couldn't replace what you brought. You brought wisdom. You brought emotional stability. You brought discernment. You brought peace. You brought presence. And these aren't things that can be faked, borrowed, or bought. These are things people either carry or they don't. And you carried them. You still do. Now, if you're wondering why, even after everything, they kept reaching out, or why their replacements never seemed to stick, it's because what they needed wasn't easily replicable. They may have tried to find others, but the energy you brought, the insight you offered, the way you held space for their brokenness while challenging their ego, these were things that came from your essence, not from your neediness. That's the irony. You weren't the dependent one. They were. You weren't addicted to their presence. They were addicted to your essence. And once you started to realize your own power, once you started to reclaim your time, your attention, your emotional bandwidth, they panicked. because you were no longer feeding the illusion. You were no longer playing your assigned role. And without your energy, they had to face the echo of their own emptiness. This is why some people don't miss you. They miss the access. They miss the convenience of being emotionally irresponsible while still being emotionally supported. They miss the comfort of being selfish without consequences. They miss the luxury of being loved unconditionally while giving the bare minimum in return. But hear this. When someone needs you more than they respect you, they will drain you without ever honoring you. They will take what is sacred and treat it as common. Not because you're not valuable, but because they were never capable of recognizing true value. And when you finally walk away, not with anger, but with clarity, you become irreplaceable. Not because they said so, but because deep in their soul, they know what they lost. So don't carry guilt. Don't question your worth. Don't let their silence confuse your significance. You weren't just part of their life. You were the best part. And just because they couldn't appreciate it doesn't mean it wasn't real. It means they weren't ready or willing or able. You weren't needy. You were necessary. You weren't desperate. You were devoted. And most of all, you weren't weak. You were wanted, but by someone who never intended to grow into the kind of person who could truly hold you. Let that truth set you free. While you were evolving, healing, expanding your mind, and rising to a new level of awareness, they were standing still. That's the real reason they couldn't keep you. Not because you changed in a bad way, but because you changed in a way they were unwilling or incapable of doing. Growth is uncomfortable for people who benefit from your stagnation. The moment you decided to grow, you became a mirror that revealed their refusal to transform. They needed you to remain in a version of yourself that tolerated cycles, excused dysfunction, and stayed small enough for them to feel big. But you outgrew that version. You began to ask different questions. You stopped reacting the same way. You saw patterns for what they were. You didn't just want peace. You began to require it. And that's when the distance started to form. Not because you pushed them away, but because your elevation demanded separation. Growth is a threat to those who manipulate stability. See, the narcissist builds a system where your survival depends on their approval. They condition you to think that your worth is tied to their presence. But the moment you stepped into awareness, when you realized your peace didn't need their chaos to exist, everything started to shift. They could feel it. They knew you were becoming something they couldn't predict. And narcissists hate unpredictability because it takes away their control. You began investing in yourself, spending time in reflection, maybe in prayer, therapy, study, or silence. While they were focused on distractions and appearances, you were digging into truth. You weren't becoming bitter. You were becoming wise. And wisdom has a way of uncloaking people. You no longer responded to guilt trips. You stopped falling for the same cycles of promises with no change. They could no longer bait you with shallow apologies. Why? Because you grew. Growth always costs you something. It costs you comfort. It costs you some connections. But what you gained was discernment, clarity, and inner authority. You started realizing that peace isn't passive. It's protected. You stopped explaining your standards. You stopped negotiating your worth. They weren't used to that. They were used to the version of you that explained, defended, and begged to be understood. But growth taught you that you don't need to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you. You started to feel a disconnection, not because you were withdrawing in bitterness, but because your spirit no longer aligned with manipulation, games, or emotional inconsistency. You no longer got high off of attention. You wanted intention. You weren't interested in being chased. You wanted to be respected. That shift in your spirit made you untouchable to someone who only knew how to operate in dysfunction. Here's the truth they don't want to admit. When you evolve, they lose access. And for someone who once held your heart, your time, your vulnerability, that loss feels unbearable. Not because they miss you as a whole person, but because they miss what you used to tolerate. The version of you that let things slide, that explained your heart 1,000 times, that lowered yourself to make things work, that version no longer exists. They can't manipulate the evolved you. They can't lie to the aware you. They can't play with the focused you. You became too conscious to be deceived, too rooted to be shaken, too whole to be baited. And that's when you knew they didn't walk away from you. They walked away from the version of you they could no longer control. So don't mourn the loss of that relationship. Rejoice in the gain of your identity. You did something they couldn't do. You changed. You faced yourself. You broke cycles. You did the inner work. And you didn't just heal, you evolved. And for those who are committed to comfort, evolution will always feel like abandonment. But you didn't abandon them. You simply refused to abandon yourself. That is why they couldn't replace you. Because your growth created a gap no imitation could fill. You became the evidence of transformation. And the truth is, once you grow, you can never shrink back. You've seen too much, you've learned too much, you've become too much. And for someone still hiding behind ego, illusions, and manipulation, that kind of growth is not only irreplaceable, it's unforgettable. When a narcissist encounters someone with a pure heart, they're often fascinated, but not in the way you might think. See, a narcissist doesn't truly understand love. They study it, they mimic it, they rehearse the performance of it, but they do not feel it, not the way you do. They see love as a strategy, not a sacrifice, a tool, not a truth. So when you showed up loving authentically, vulnerably, deeply, they didn't know how to respond. You weren't following a script. You weren't manipulating to gain. You were just giving. And that unsettled them more than you know. You loved without agenda. You gave without tracking. You forgave when you had every right to turn bitter. You stayed soft when life had every excuse to make you hard. That kind of love, it leaves a mark. A narcissist might forget your face, your birthday, your words, but they will never forget the feeling of your presence. Because it wasn't artificial. It wasn't manufactured. It was real, and it held up a mirror to everything they lacked. They tried to recreate it after you left. They looked for it in others. Replacements, temporary surrogates, people they could mold, control, flatter, and drain. But here's the thing, you can't replace a source with a substitute. They realized quickly that charm doesn't equal depth. Attention doesn't equal affection. Compliance doesn't equal connection. What they found in others was performance. What they had with you was purity. That's what makes you irreplaceable. You see, people who operate through manipulation believe everyone else is performing too. They think everyone has an angle. So when you came into their life with sincerity, they didn't believe it at first. They questioned it, they tested it, they even punished it, because it exposed them. When someone is empty inside, authentic love doesn't feel comforting. It feels threatening. It shines too bright. It reveals too much. It makes excuses disappear. And that's exactly what your love did. But here's the truth. They won't say out loud. They miss you. Not because of the supply, not because you gave them attention or boosted their image, but because deep down, your love touched the part of them they don't want to acknowledge. The part that longs to be whole but refuses to heal. They know they didn't earn it, but they got it anyway. And that haunts them. Because they know they didn't lose just anyone. They lost something rare. You loved them in a way they couldn't replicate even if they tried. And they have tried. You didn't just offer affection. You offered safety. Emotional safety. A space where they could have learned to be human if they wanted to. But they chose the illusion, the image, the cycle. And you walked away not because your love failed, but because it refused to keep paying a price your soul couldn't afford. That's a different kind of power, a different kind of strength. You were not naive for loving them. You were not foolish for believing in their potential. You saw the possibility, what they could have been if they surrendered the mask. That was your gift, not just to love, but to see. And what they'll never tell you is that no one has seen them like that since. So let them pretend. Let them post and perform and parade. You already know it's not real. You've seen behind the curtain. And while they try to keep up appearances, you are moving forward with your truth, your healing, your peace. You're no longer trying to convince someone of your worth. You're no longer shrinking to be digestible. You're no longer mistaking struggle for loyalty. They couldn't mimic what you gave them because what you gave them was rooted in who you are. You can't counterfeit authenticity. You can't fake spirit. You can't manufacture light. And that's what you were to them. Light in a house full of mirrors. They didn't destroy your love. They just mishandled it. And now all they can do is remember. You were the original, the standard, the experience that made everything after you feel hollow. That's not heartbreak. That's legacy.